Next on the list is a very well-known singer, at least during his time, and that is Roy Brown. He's also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in this episode, he's also the contender for having made one of the first rock and roll songs ever. That song is Good Rocking Tonight, and it may sound familiar for multiple reasons. I'll mention it a little bit later, but multiple artists performed the song, and each of them experienced their own level of success uh, for recording the song. But Roy Brown is originally from Louisiana. He got his start singing in churches, and as a young adult, he moved to LA. He wanted to try to be a boxer at first, and then when that didn't work out, he actually went back to LA for a period of time, and tried to become a singer. Um, so he found his first success actually in Texas, and his first success was "Good Rocking Tonight" as one of his first hit. And what had happened with that song is he had written the song, and his friend, and also actually is one of his idols was Wynonie Harris, and so he actually tried to give the song to Wynonie Harris first before recording it itself, and Wynonie Harris didn't want it at the time, and so he recorded it, and it was a big hit, and potentially the first rock and roll song. And then after that, Wynonie Harris recorded a version, and so there's a debate. Part of the debate is, is it the first rock and roll song ever? That's like if you're not already familiar, there's quite a debate. There's like a number of songs that people have in the running. On this timeline, it would probably be the first one, but the timeline is not necessarily structured to discover the first rock and roll song. But this is the first contender that is on our list. As I mentioned in another episode, Saturday Night Fish Fry is another song that people talk about because of the overdriven guitar, and they use the word rocking, which obviously this song also uses rocking. And that came out a couple years later, and I talked about that as being an early contender for rock and roll. So I think, depending on what you think when you listen to this song, that could eliminate that as a contender. But I don't think this timeline is necessarily for determining the aspect. We definitely don't have enough of the early rock and roll songs to kind of try to figure it out. But if there's any input, thoughts about it, I'm definitely open to the debate. I personally I don't have a favorite for which one should be known as the first. But I think this is a good contender. It's Good Rockin' Tonight. It sounds like it would be a rock and roll song. But part of the debate is actually between Roy Brown's and Wynonie Harris's versions, because Wynonie Harris is a little bit more upbeat. It's a little bit more, I guess, intense in comparison. And then excuse me. And then we'll talk about the last version in a second. One of the interesting things about Good Rocking Tonight is that it has a beat that would later be known as a diddly beat. And the diddly beat was actually kind of big more so for funk than anything, and then later hip hop. But it was Bo Diddley was known in the rock and roll and blues era, and the Diddley beat actually has West African um, West African connection, and so it's interesting just because this is present. It's present in other genres. It was present in jazz, but one of the things when we get to Bo Diddley on the timeline is it was a big deal when that became a portion of this side of the lineage in the blues lineage, R&B, rock and roll, and funk. And so it is interesting that it's introduced earlier in the timeline and becomes a part of rock and roll. Um, um, and and another thing about the song is just based on the time it was recorded, it would have been released still as race music, as we talked about before. Early music that was made by black people and deemed for black people was called race music, not with the exception of jazz. So it would have been released as race music, but this was right near the crossover when the charts and record companies started to shift their labeling to R&B, and so it would have been released as a race record, but it would have hit the charts as an R&B hit. So a little interesting. We'll talk about the charts and whatnot a little bit more in, I think it's next episode. Yeah, because that's when we'll talk about the transition from race music to R&B a little bit more. So his version was successful. Wynonie Harris's version, maybe a little bit more rock and roll, but also successful, even more successful. But neither was as famous or as successful as Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley recorded his, I'm not sure when it was, but it became like a gold. It went gold selling album or whatever it would be called. But super successful. And that's a trend that happens especially now. Well, not now, but now in the timeline, the 1950s, 1960s. It definitely happened earlier also, but just artists re-recording a more culturally appropriate or more radio-friendly, just basically sometimes some people might say watered down alternate version. This happened numerous times where these type of versions were re-recorded and then became more successful because they were released into a different genre. They would be released on the pop charts, or the rock and roll charts don't really exist until much later. And then, of course, later on, the charts became a little bit less race-based. Of course, right now we're shifting from race to R&B charts. So you see artists later on, not just black artists, some white artists entering those charts. But it stays. The racial lines stay pretty firm, generally speaking. For a long time, and so, but that was common. Re-records and the other artists who record it and have the more radio-friendly version become more successful and have a bigger hit than their original recording artist. And often the original recording artists, one of the reasons that some of these artists are included in the timeline and not well known was because of just that, people recording more successful music, more successful versions of their music without necessarily giving the credit, or even the credit is due. the artist is not adequately compensated, or just it's just a product of the times in which you can say what you want, but what's done has been done. You've created a essentially copied their music and made a more popular version of it, and some people will say that's fair. I don't know. It's definitely a discussion to be had. Roy Brown's biggest hit, most well known hit, was "Hard Luck Blues," which is it's definitely a slow blues song. So it's a little bit of a departure from what most of his songs were more of like a jump blues, early R&B style, kind of a rock and roll. But "Hard Luck Blues" was and which is his most famous song, was definitely a blues hit, and was released in 1950, and it reached number one. So it's kind of interesting. Um, he was known for um, his somewhat scandalous lyrics. He has really unique voice. If you ever haven't listened to Roy Brown, definitely check him out because he has a very interesting voice. His lyrics for that time were seen as a little bit more scandalous, a little bit. I won't even say raunchy because if you look at them, it's hard to. It can be a little bit hard. You can see how they're a little bit suggestive in some situations, but it's it's kind of hard to exactly see where the controversy would come in. But that was, he was a big influence on guys like Elvis. Obviously, he re-recorded one of his songs, but we were entering into that era where a lot of these artists are trying to the styles are trending towards the pop genre. You'll see a lot of pop artists start to mimic and borrow or yeah, emulate, as I was just kind of saying, these styles and these lyrics and the songs all together. In some cases, of course, with Elvis, Roy Brown is one. Another one that people will talk about is Jackie Wilson. As far as where he got a lot of his, where he potentially got a lot of his influence from, among other places. And so basically within that time period, 1947, 1952, he had another number of other hits. That was kind of definitely the peak of his career. And he kept touring after that, but, that was kind of the peak of his success. We didn't really see a whole lot after that. And that's Roy Brown.